In the last lecture, we learned about fundamental of security like authentication, authorization, and various security attacks that can be avoided by Spring Security. So in this lecture, we are going to implement a super simple Spring Security Hello World using Spring Boot 2. And then we will understand how does Hello World works in depth. So in order to create a Hello World application, a couple of things you need to know. Like I'm using Spring Tool Suite, which is version 3.9.4, which is latest version, and I'm using Java 8 and Spring Boot 2.0, and also the Spring Security version 3.5. So there are many ways to create a Spring Boot project. Like you can use this IDE, or in case you are using a different IDE like Eclipse older version where Spring Boot is not supported, then in that case you have to go to Spring website like start.spring.io, and you can select what kind of dependency management tool you want to use, like Maven or Gradle. Then the technology is by default Java, and the Spring Boot version. So the latest Spring Boot version is 2.0.1, which is a general availability. So I'm going to use this one, and after that you have to define your group ID and artifact ID, and then select for the dependency, like what kind of dependency you want to use in your project. So for our project, by default it would be web and security. So these two are the mandatory dependency that we need to use, and other than that you can use MySQL or any other dependency, but right now in the Hello World it is not needed. So this is the only two dependency that is needed right now. And then you can click on the generate project, and you will get a zip file here, and you can just extract this zip file in your local system, and then you can import this local local project into your current IDE. So you can go to import and then select Maven and choose the existing Maven project and just next, and you can just import that. So that's one way to implement that. Another way is just you create a simple Maven project and copy the POM file from existing Spring Boot project or existing that demo file, that the zip file that we had created. So there is another way that I'm going to use this Spring Tool Suite. So there is a built-in support for this. So let's see how to create that. So right click anywhere in the workspace and go to new and Spring Starter, then select and then type the name of project, Spring Security Hello World, and then choose the type of dependency management. So by default I'll keep to Maven, then Java version, and then the group ID. So group ID is going to be com.developer_visits, and the package that I'm going to use here is com.developer_visits, and then click on next. Now this is the most important thing, is that you have to select the dependency. So first you need to check which Spring Boot version you want to use. So by default I'm going to stick with the 2.0, which is general availability, and then dependency that we need in our project. So the first dependency is Spring Web, because I am going to use Spring Security using Spring Web MVC, and then the second one is Security Core. So these two are the mandatory dependency that we need. Other than this, I am going to use one more dependency, which is called DevTool. And this DevTools basically helps that in case you make any changes in your project, so the change will be detected by this DevTool and the server will be restarted automatically. So you don't have to worry about how to restart the server or stop the server. So click on next and finish. It will take a couple of seconds to download the dependency if it is not downloaded already. So we are done now. Now let's take a look into the pom.xml, that what are the dependencies that are included by default. So if you look into the dependencies tag, here is our Spring Starter Security that we had selected, and there is a Spring Web, which is basically Spring Boot started web, and then there is a dev tool dependency that we had selected. So these three that are mentioned here because we had selected that. And there are other two that are included by default by this IDE, which is basically Spring. This is basically nothing but the test related package, so you don't have to worry about that. In case you don't want to be here, you can just simply select this and delete it. It will automatically adjust that. But right now I'm not going to touch it because it's just a super simple hello world application. So let's see the file structure now. So if you look at the src main.java, by default the package is created here, and there is one file called Spring Security Hello World Application.java. So in this file you can see there is a two important lines written here: the Spring Boot application annotation and Spring application.run, and the class name itself passing the Spring Security Hello World application. So this is the only, and then another one is Spring main resources, where the most important thing is that you need to look into that application properties, which is by default nothing is written there. And then there is a dependency, Maven dependency, which we can see Spring Security Config 5.0, Spring AOP, and Spring Security other core related jar you can see here. And there is another important jar that we will look into that later, that Spring Boot auto configure jar, which you can see somewhere. Spring Boot auto configure. So we will take a look into that later, how to do that. So first let's run this application. Right click, run as Spring Boot app, and let's increase the console. Now you see by default we haven't added anything in our application. It was a super simple hello world application, and if you look at the console log, you will see by default it is using Apache Tomcat on port 8080. So that's our server. And then there are a couple of filters that got mapped, which is character encoding filter, hidden HTTP method filter, and there is another one, Spring Security filter chain. So we will take a look into that, what is the Spring Security filter chain and what is going on behind the scene, how does this gets configured by Spring Boot. And then there is a URL mapping, which is basically by default when you add a Spring web jars, it will automatically adds these kind of advice and controllers. Everything is basically done by the Spring Boot by default. So we will take a look into that, how Spring Boot configures Spring Security, how does Spring Boot configure Spring Security and Spring Web. And then you see here there is a one line of statement using generated security password, and this is the unique UUID random number. So this is a default password that is generated by the Spring Boot for the purpose of login in Spring Security. So let's let's try to access any resource on this server. Like I'm going to use localhost 8080 since our server is running on 8080, and then I'm going to access any resource. By default there is no resource available, so I'm going to use just get resource.htm. So let's see if this resource is available or not. So by default, there is no resource available on the server. It's a simple plain Java file available here. So there is no mapping, there is no controller, nothing available there, right? So let's access this resource and see what happened right now. So when you click on this, by default you see you redirected to the login page, right? So there is something happening behind the scene that we are not aware of it. And then again the question come, why do we see this login password? What would be the user? What would be the password? And why do we see that by default? Because you see the Spring Boot automatically configure the Spring Security, which means that any resource you want to access on the on the you want to access on this site, it is a protected, so you must have to be authenticated, right? We learned about the authentication, you have to provide your identity. So for that, by default, the Spring Boot provide the identity where the username is user and password is generated security password. So this is our generated security password, so you have to use this as a password here, and this can be changed every time when your server restarts. So make sure that you, when your server restart or you make any change, so server restart, they will generate again a new password, so you have to use this password again and again. So in that case, the password would be like this. So when I press on the login page, login button, you see we were trying to access get resource.htm. Since that resource is not available on the server, so you will get 404, right? 404. So this means that if there is any file, any controller which serves this resource, then you will get the response over here. But since there is nothing, so you won't get anything here. So and that's authenticated resource, that's why you are able to reach there. So if you create any controller over here and you try to access that resource over the web, then you by default you will get access because you are already authenticated. So that's how the authentication happens. So if you want to access any protected resource, first you have to tell that your identity, what is your username and what is your password. That's a simple hello world application for a Spring Security using Spring Boot. But that's not what we want here, right? We want to understand what is going on behind the scene. I mean, you must have many questions in your mind, like how does Spring Boot know that there is a Spring Security? How does Spring Boot know that there is a Spring WebJar? We did not set up any configuration, and how does Spring Security gets applied here? Where is the code written? We did not add any login form, right? We did not add any login form, and we saw that login form here in the login form. If you just click here login, so we did not set up anything, right? And if you look at the source code, you will see that there is a login form available by default, and the username is username, and you see the form, the action is by default login. So who received this request? I mean, when you press on the submit button, where is this handler is written, login handler? So these are the different questions that you must have in your mind. So let's take a look into that in next lecture.